Hello there, and welcome to What's the Point? A question we should all be asking ourselves, and the podcast by brand architect Bill Ellis that will help you discover, clarify, and live your purpose.
Welcome back, everybody, to What's the Point? And welcome to any new listeners. We're so happy that you're here. And today you're going to hear from a guest who is just an incredible man, a powerful human being, and one that I'm so very grateful to have met and that he's agreed to be my guest. Fred Falkner is the president of Faulkner Consulting Group. Good morning, Fred.
Good morning. Good morning, all.
Hey, good. Well, hey, again, thank you so much for making time to be here. I think it's very important to speak with you on several fronts, not the least of which is the primary reason I do this podcast is so that people can see through others and their stories how people discover and clarify their purpose and live their purpose. And you've certainly done that, and purpose evolves over time. But the other thing, and this won't surprise you, obviously, but for the benefit of my listeners, Fred has been a longtime organizational development consultant. He's done a lot of work with the St. Louis Zoo, which is one of the highest rated zoos in the land, if not the world. But importantly, Fred advocates a different approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I won't talk much about that right now because I'm going to let Fred do that. But everyone listening is aware of some of the issues and some of the stress and some of the differences that have been really in the news over the past 4, 5, 6 years, really amplified. So I think now is as good a time as any to talk about this. And it's not political, it's societal. So with that, I think it's time for me to quit talking and to let my guest Fred say, talk to us a little bit, please, Fred, about your approach from difference to distance.
Okay. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity. And I think maybe it's best to kind of start with just a little bit of background. I started in college many years ago, and I started as a result of what at that time was the beginning stirring of the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. So a group of students, graduate students at the university that I ultimately went to, took over a couple of buildings, as was the norm in those days. Take over buildings, you have a protest. The university was very responsive to that protest and invited a lot of African American students. And I believe we were Black students at that time, and so those names changed, but invited a lot of students. I think even to this day, it's probably the largest single freshman class. Being at that school gave me an opportunity to do a lot of thinking about this subject. And in fact, I ended up majoring in what was then called Black Studies. So how important was this concept, these ideas at that time? We literally created a department to support African American students in doing a lot of thinking. Well, over the years, I've seen these things come and go and come and go and come and go. And we have periods of time, pretty much like we're going through right now, where there's a great deal of polarization, a great deal of fragmentation, a ton of fragmentation. And what I see and have seen for the last almost 50 years now is the up and down, up and down, up and down, how we rethink diversity, equity, and inclusion. These last two terms have been added, but how ultimately, in my mind, we have made some progress, steady progress, but not the kind of progress that I think most people actually want. When I started in the business, the one thing that I didn't want was to be a diversity consultant. I left corporate America doing leadership training, and I developed some performance management instruments. And at that time, because this was quite a few years ago, African Americans didn't do a lot in corporate America. And if they did, it was as diversity consultants. Mm-hmm. So the last thing I wanted anybody to think about me was that that's what I did. My ideas have really always been different. I had a number of customers and clients that said, "Hey, Fred, after I've done other engagements with them, would you want to do this?" And I, of course, always said no. And part of the reason, Bill, is that I never exactly thought that what was being done was going to deliver the kind of results that we wanted. Somehow, in the midst of all of that, I stumbled on an idea, and I won't take credit for the idea, because it seems to me that I've read this thinking, I've seen this thinking in so many other places, but it didn't really come together. And that really is this distance model, and that's the idea, that's the central idea, and that is the point that I would want to get across to people who might be listening to this. And it starts from the idea that what we're doing now in this particular field is making incremental change, necessary change, important change, but can never produce the results that we actually want. Here's the point. We are not now, nor have we ever been, divided by our differences. And so when I talk about differences, I'm talking about race and gender and ethnicity, gender identity, generation now, which is a big thing for me to think about, that we divide each other up in order to understand the world, to make sense of the world, to allow ourselves to survive when times are tough. So it is the way the brain works, but we're not divided by those differences. What we are is separated by distance. And if I can explain that, it is a paradigm shift that in my mind is as significant as any paradigm shift that has ever occurred. We are not divided by the lines that we see. So we're not divided by race. We recognize that race is a social construct. What we don't necessarily understand is so is gender, and so is every other classification system. When I say it's a social construct, I simply mean that in order to understand the world around us, it's what we have to do as human beings. We literally have to draw lines. We draw lines to separate us from them, and from good from bad, from tall to short. We draw lines. That's how we make sense of the world. But there is another way to understand the relationships that we have. So it's not a line between races. What we have is separation between individual human beings. And that separation can be physical, but mostly now, and especially in this time, it is really emotional. An emotional separation, by that I simply mean it is the distance between you and I, or between myself and another person, that is not, it's not geography. It's not a mountain range, but it is distance nevertheless. I can sit next to somebody on a bus and be emotionally far away from that person. Yes. To the extent that I do that, I don't see that person as a person. I see that person as one of them, as an object. And part of the problem with what we're doing right now in the modern DEI approach is that it all relies on that fatally false first assumption that the differences that we see are real. And if they're real, then everything else that follows we should be doing, because we now have to operate on those differences. But if in fact those differences are our own constructions, I would say nature does not draw lines. Mm-hmm. If those differences are our constructions, then they can't be the thing that creates the very real problems that we have. The problems described by many people working in the DEI world are real problems. The disparate impact, problems between different communities. We see these problems on the grand scale in terms of the pandemic, in terms of conservation, in terms of climate change. We see these problems everywhere, and they've been the problems of human beings since human beings have been on the planet. Since all of those things are real, but the idea of how we fix them right now is flawed, then we need a better, different approach. And this approach is really what I would call the distance paradigm. We are separated by space. And then once you see that, then the solutions that we need and the thinking about coming up with solutions, because I'm not claiming to have all of them, But now suddenly these solutions
Mhm.
become far more apparent.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, and I want to make sure that we dive into it a little bit more. So, you mentioned that um, differences aren't real, but would it be fair to say that the differences are literally real, but the attributes and the assessments and the judgment we make as a result of those differences is where the problem might lie? Is that fair?
I think that's very fair. And to the extent that differences are real, they are real because we have created them. So once in our minds, once we draw the distinction, any distinction, then that becomes a difference. I had a conversation with a good friend just last night, and we talked about the difference between variability and difference. Well, variability is just that. It becomes difference, however, as soon as somebody draws a line. So when we draw that line, and that line then becomes something that divides us one from another.
Yeah, and I think I'm trying to communicate what you're saying, and so let me take another stab at this. So you're a black man, I'm a white man. There's very clearly a difference right there.
Right.
So there is a difference that can't be denied. So I guess the line that you're talking about is what I may think of you as a black man, what you may think of me as a white man, based on nature and nurture and life experience and outside influences that start to shape our perception of that difference, which creates the lines you're talking about. Yes?
Mostly.
Okay.
We created that first line, though. And so that's the piece when you get down to what's the shift. The shift is actually the recognition that we've created the first line. I think it's really important to understand that I want anybody that sees me to recognize me as an African-American man. I want that, and most people of color would want to be seen. We protect, we value our identities, but all of those things are a function of how we need to be able to understand the world around us.
Okay.
So to understand, to think about what makes somebody African American, you could draw that line, and it has been drawn for hundreds of years in various places. Whether you're an African American by virtue of being one quarter, having one grandparent, or having one great grandparent, or what became the norm, which would be one drop of African American of black blood. Those are all the lines that we draw, and that creates the difference that we see. Once it's created, that difference is there.
Okay.
The problem is not what we see. The problem really is what we do. And so I think that's really getting back to your point. It's what that difference means to me.
Right.
That creates our issue. And so now the issue is not the difference. The issue is the space that I put between myself and people like that. And that space is always in my head. I'm standing back from people who are, quote, different. I'm staying away from this group or that group. My beliefs make it hard for me to connect with others as human beings. It's my beliefs that allow me not to make eye contact, not to speak in a way that could create a positive human experience and a positive human relationship. To the extent that I see people in a particular group all as the same thing, then I have now dehumanized or depersonalized them. And when I do that, then my ability to communicate and create value for them, my ability to add something to their lives, and our collective ability to have solutions for our collective problems become very, very difficult. I think we really see that in the polarization inside of this country, but it's polarization really all around the world. We see each other as objects, not as people we can talk to. And then we approach each other through that lens of them being different, as opposed to the lens of, I don't know this person. You know, the old Abraham Lincoln quote, which is, I don't like that man, or I don't like that person. So I think I really now need to get to know him. Well, that is just as true now for, I don't know that person. I know about him. I took a class and it said that people like that are the following 7 or 8 things. I see somebody who's a millennial and I don't know them, but I think I know about them. The way to be human, and the way I certainly think the work should go, is that we have to learn how to create and develop relationships with people. So I would say to somebody that there are no fault lines, there are no barriers, there are no obstacles to our connecting as human beings. All that exists between any of us is distance. Now, that distance, once you recognize it, is something that I can choose to reduce or close, or I can choose not to. But it now falls on me. If there's nothing that needs to be torn down, nothing that needs to be dismantled, nothing that needs to be removed or bridged, then my power, my ability is to move forward towards you as a person. And frankly, we all know how to do that. We know how to signal people that we're open to exploring the possibility of connecting. We know how to signal people that I am vulnerable. I am allowing myself to be that toward you at this very moment, and hope that you will in turn do the same thing. But what we know about human beings is that, you know, to the extent that we kind of hide behind our little shields, when somebody puts theirs down first, usually others put theirs down, because we now start feeling safe. So this whole thing is predicated on the idea, how do you get to know human beings? How do we lead from that perspective as leaders in an organization? How do you start leading in such a way that invites people in? How do you invite people, and how do we recognize that there is a huge difference between excluding somebody and failure to invite them in? And I think that's just absolutely critical. We talk about inclusion a lot in organizations. Well, inclusion is a condition. It's a condition that it's the way employees experience a particular place. Do I feel that I belong? Do I have a sense that my leader, my manager, cares about me as a human being? Do I care for and about others? Do I feel psychologically safe in this place? Do I have a sense that I am an owner, that I can provide discretionary effort? To the extent all those things come together, and that they don't have to come together all the times, then I would tell you as my leader, my boss, that this is a place where I feel included. Now, the opposite of that, and we remember this as kids, is feeling excluded. You know, I didn't get chosen for the team. They had a party and didn't invite me. My friends went off over in a corner and talked, and I knew that I was not welcome. Well, that's exclusion. Where most of our organizations are, we exclude some people.
Right.
And yes, some people feel included, but the vast majority of the people are right in the middle. And that is not the same as being included. Okay. Failure to include is ultimately as bad as exclusion when it comes to organizational growth and development, really serving the people well, getting the most out of human beings.
Yeah, and in one way, I think that my reaction to what you just said is this, that first of all, I agree with you, but not being included is almost the same as being excluded. But here's a difference as I see it. If you are excluded, you know you're excluded, and you at least have some definitive parameters. Yes. And you're able to start to understand your place and where you can go and not go. So you've talked a lot here, and if you will, let me ask you to go back just a couple of years. Let's say to your childhood in Indiana.
Yep.
I've heard a couple of your anecdotes about what it was like growing up as an African American boy. And can you share some of those just to start to establish the? I think it's important to set the stage for not only what you experienced, but how other people your age had already started to become somewhat indoctrinated to drawing these lines.
Yeah. Well, I happened to grow up in a neighborhood in a medium-sized city, town, big town in Indiana, and the particular area I grew up in was pretty diverse. We had a Jewish family and a Mexican family, white families, and a single Black family. I can remember the first 4 or 5 years of life, never, ever, ever thinking about the lines or thinking about a difference. I do remember meeting my first white child who would have been my age, and I think I would have been struck right then about by the noticing the shade of his skin, but because there was no distance, it didn't matter. So in other words, I saw the difference, but it did not divide us,
right?
Because there was nothing there. There was no line there. It was a difference, but not a line.
And I think that's the essential, most basic point to your entire premise, is that, you know, we can notice a difference, but it does not create any type of barrier line or anything. So anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, I think that's just, so at some other time you start learning that difference that you see is considered a line by a lot of people. And at that point in time, you learn how to be divided. You learn how to distance yourself from whoever them is. You are bombarded by the stories about why it's this way and how you should react to people on the other side. I can remember going to a movie as a child with my mother and my best friend at the time. And I went to a school, I think I was the only Black child. No, I was the only Black child in this particular school. So my best friend obviously would have had to been white. So we went to the movie, and I guess the boy used the N-word. And I don't think that I know that I had no idea whatsoever what that was. But I remember my mother correcting him about, we don't use that word. I never, ever heard my mother say anything like that. But those things really kind of happen in hindsight. Moved to St. Louis, Missouri, when I was 10, and suddenly now I was in a African-American school in the African-American neighborhood. So started learning something. Of course, my mother knew this all the time. My mother and father always knew these things, but somehow we didn't have those kinds of conversations. Now in this school, I was the person who was really different. Even though I was in a school with all African-American kids, I was the person who stood out as different. And I stood out as different because I was from Indiana, and in Indiana, we didn't sound like we do in St. Louis. And that was a noticeable difference that people worked to make into a divide. As a child, as a young person, you quickly learn how to kind of bridge that. You quickly learn how to speak differently. Those are the unfortunate things that I think you'll learn when you feel that you are divided by lines, and no one ever says, hey, as human beings, we're all connected to one another. We can be farther apart sometimes, or we can be closer together. Here's what you should do. And so I went to an all Black school in St. Louis, and then went to the university. And at that time, as I mentioned before, a lot of changes were going on. And so learned how to do even more of that, seeing the line, saying that the line meant this or that.
Yeah. So Fred, you have obviously a great deal of personal experience in diversity or lack of diversity, inclusion or lack of inclusion, obviously based on racial lines. But as you were talking about moving from Indiana to St. Louis, what triggered in my mind is when I was young, and we're about the same age, when I was young, we moved an awful lot, not because my dad couldn't pay the rent, but because he was in the Army. Right. And we would get transferred every 2 years, maybe 3 years. And so it was a very similar dynamic to what you just described, moving to St. Louis, where Um, moving to a new city, typically on or near a military base, there's the same thing of starting to notice differences and start to not necessarily create lines, but create boxes and place people, is this someone that I can relate to? Is this someone I should be cautious of? So I think it's important to say that the most obvious, in particular in this day and age, I think, and what we've seen starting, for decades, but really focused because of George Floyd. But it goes beyond race as well.
Yes.
And so the premise, I just want to make sure everyone listening broadens their thinking to understand that this isn't just race. It just happens to be one of the most obvious lines that we can draw or have been drawn.
I think that's right. I think it's important to kind of recognize that if you traveled to other places in the world, there would still be lines. There would still be those places of demarcation where people didn't get along with people on the other side of the line because it was us and them. And so
Right.
we see these lines when we divide people up in this way, we see these lines as the source of conflict. So we want to really think about the line. What I'm suggesting and what my work does is saying, well, it's not the line. What it actually is that we don't communicate. We don't talk with one another. We have the ability to do it, but we don't do it. One of the things that I was struck by, somebody talked to me a couple of years ago, introduced me to the Christmas truce, which was the thing, and I think it was in World War I, the soldiers, I think they were British soldiers on one side of the line and German soldiers on the other. This is trench warfare, so they literally sat in these trenches for months at a time,
Right.
Dying of all kinds of diseases while your enemy was a couple of 100 yards away. Well, at some point in time, so the story goes, I believe one of the sides heard the other side singing Christmas carols. They sang even though it was the same tune, but maybe
Right.
in a different language, but somehow somebody is brave enough to put down his weapon, show himself, and begins to sing. People on the other side start singing, and then what you see then is human beings coming together to sing Christmas carols, it was called the Christmas Truce, to have a truce for some period of time. And then ultimately, when the Christmas season is over, to go back into the foxholes. Now, the problem for generals and the problem for leaders in these wars is that damage to the line was irreparable. And so they made clear rules, the people in charge, that can never happen again.
Okay.
We can't go back to killing each other when we stop seeing the line and recognize that they're human and we're human, and we exchanged photos and we broke bread together and we sang carols together. We are worshiping the same God. So the strong rules came that, hey, we'll never do that again. That's the power, I think, of connecting with human beings.
So that's a great story and very, I think, relative, and if not relevant, it's certainly relatable to today and your current work in organizational development. What kind of lessons can we learn from the Christmas truce and take into our current life, our current business, and whatever role we play as leaders?
I think that first piece that we have to get is that we have to start thinking about, as leaders, it is our job, it is our central role to be inclusive. And that to be inclusive in the way I'm describing it has to be an intentional act, because we are so accustomed to seeing lines. We create distance automatically between ourselves and the others. And usually it's not terrible distance. It's not where I don't like them. It's just that I'm a little bit uncomfortable talking to that person. I'm not sure how I would say whatever. I don't know how to have these conversations. Well, that's the piece that has some people feeling included, a huge plus. That's where you want to be. You want to spend your career there. You tell your friends and family, this is a great place to work. You're all in, you're invested in the work. And the other place is it's a job. My leader treats me with respect, and I have dignity. I get all of those things, but I don't feel that I'm around the table. I don't feel that I'm a part of this organization. That is where our huge loss is. So we have to, first of all, help leaders understand, I think, that inclusion is a condition for employees. It is what employees feel, but it is an act of leadership. Okay. That means the leaders have to intentionally begin doing those things that create that condition or that experience. That is something that lies outside for most of us. The great leaders, I think when you look at and describe what great leaders look like, they are inclusive leaders. They didn't need to go to a class for it. Somehow they've got the ability to reach out to more people, to have more people feel that they are involved and a part of and belong. And many of the rest of us do it less. The more we do it, the more we'll be seen as that leader. When somebody has asked, talk about a great leader you had, then they are describing inclusive leaders. They're always describing those people who make people feel like I'm somebody. I'm at the lowest rung of this organization. But when my leader walks by, I believe she knows me. Mm-hmm. She looks at me directly. She makes eye contact. Our policies, how we treat people around here, makes all of us feel that we matter, that we are important. Whatever job I do, I know it's important to somebody here. Right. We have to work on changing that mindset. To get people to do that, then you have to talk about, well, how do you go about reducing distance and closing that space? How do you get leaders to come out of their comfort zone? And again, people, in our generation, we're taught, hey, let's not try to connect to all of these people. Let's not try to be emotionally entangled with our employees. Let's stay away from them. But the lessons that we've learned and that I think we know, that the great leaders are cared about by their employees because their employees believe that they care about them. Mm-hmm. That didn't happen in isolation. It can't happen on the top floor in the organization. It can't happen for a leader who walks by people and doesn't speak. We've got to get everybody in leadership to start behaving more inclusively. I would go even farther. You can't be a good leader, in my mind, and not behave in an inclusive fashion. It is the foundation of leadership. Whatever else we do, to the extent that we don't invite people in, we don't invite people to belong, we don't produce the conditions that allow people to feel great about the places that we lead, we are leaving an awful lot of good things on the table, things that are available to us.
Yeah, so I see two sides to this. The first is to be proactive in being more inclusive and in setting the atmosphere to be more inclusive throughout an organization. But the other thing, and this ties back to your World War I Christmas Truce story, I think that it's also equally important, if not more important, I'll get your thoughts on that in just a second, to start to eliminate the exclusion that happens. And we talked earlier that being between included and not excluded might be a little bit of uncomfortable ground, but you're closer to being included if you're not expressly excluded. So if leaders can diminish the exclusionary practices, then inclusionary practices become much more possible.
Yeah, I agree with that. The current DEI movement really works on getting rid of the exclusionary processes and practices. And that's where it does the best job. In other words, it can identify those things that a lot of us would say, oh my God, that's a terrible practice. Why would you do that? Doesn't that make, so we can fix those. Those are things that we can fix by having somebody in senior leadership almost stroke of the pen kind of leadership.
Mhm.
We will not do that thing again. We will change this practice. We will change that practice. Those things can get rid of most of the exclusionary practices,
Right.
because those things tend to be, when I went to school, I was included as opposed to excluded by somebody simply looking at the line that had been drawn and said, can Fred Falker actually do this work? Well, yes. Well, why were we not allowing him to do the work? Well, because we drew a line. So we can change those things. But treating an African American fairly is not the same thing at all as, you are now a part of this organization, and you're not going to be a part of this organization because I say you are. You're going to be a part of this organization because of how you are treated by all of the rest of us. It is in that space where we change our behavior toward people that things change. One of the things that I've always said is that policies, you can't change policies and create inclusion. You can change policies and get rid of some exclusion.
Right.
But you can't include people. Inclusion comes from an invitation. And we can't invite ourselves. Somebody else has to invite us. Our leaders inviting us to feel a part of this. But it's not just leaders. When the organizations I work in, we want to make sure that everybody has a sense that your job is to invite others in. Their job is to invite you. You cannot include yourself.
Right. So as I see it, it's somewhat evolutionary, or it evolves from, we've got to get rid of the exclusionary things, which can be done with a policy stroke, but that doesn't have the impact or the effect that we really want to get without the proactive and consistent focus on inclusion. Yes?
Absolutely.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about organizational development and a lot about diversity and equity and inclusion. And I'm going to shift our focus just a little bit, because you've spent so many years working, as I mentioned earlier, at the St. Louis Zoo. And it's become one of the premier zoos in certainly the US, if not beyond. So first of all, thank you for that, and congratulations for the impact you've had there, because it's not just the physical location, it's also the attitude and the love of the people that work there and volunteer there for the organization, if you will, but also for the guests that come to see it, and first and foremost for the animals and how their care is. So thank you for that. We have a mutual friend, Barry Engelhardt, who's just brilliant and was one of my earlier guests. If you want to check out his episode, if you haven't, very insightful man. But we were talking a little bit about the fact that you and I were going to speak this morning, and he brought up a great question that we're going to throw at you. So think of this as me channeling my inner Barry. Clearly, the zoo has as its primary focus animals, giving people the opportunity to see and experience animals that they otherwise would only see in books or nowadays on the internet. And the zoo itself has evolved and continues to evolve to try to put those animals as best as you can in a more natural habitat. And all of that is fabulous. But is the zoo somewhat of a means to an end, as far as a way to bring people together and to use that venue as a way to start eliminating some of these lines?
It certainly can be. It certainly can be. And I would say that I believe that it is for an awful lot of people. When you gather people together and we are focusing on whatever the benefits that we're getting out of being at the zoo, it can do that, and it can do more of it. And so I think I'm going to go back and correct you on one thing. The St. Louis Zoo was always a great place. Right. So I didn't bring that. It has been one of the most significant zoos in the world for years, and obviously the people in St. Louis love it. You know, when we think about what are our cultural attractions, the St. Louis Zoo is one of those things that gets mentioned very quickly. The zoo, the arch, and maybe the baseball Cardinals if you're a baseball fan. So those are the big things in St. Louis. What I think I was able to do for the zoo is to help it become just as great a place for the people that work there. The people that worked at the St. Louis Zoo loved working at the zoo, but they weren't always feeling that they themselves were elevated, that they actually mattered. They were there because of their passion, love for animals, this idea that they want to save the planet. They would have stayed there regardless. But to create a culture where they felt better being there seemed to me to be the right thing. And I think a lot of leaders can think about that. Yes, we're doing the job, and we're doing a great job of doing that job. But places of employment can be a lot more than places where we get work done. They can be a lot more than places where we serve others well. We have human beings that actually work here, and perhaps, we should be thinking an awful lot more about them. Our people would do these things no matter what. What we don't realize is that if we gave more, we would get more, because they frankly would have more energy to do more. And I think that's what we saw. That was the change. In terms of animal welfare and conservation, St. Louis Zoo has always been great. It will always be great. In terms of community and culture and how people feel about working there, I think that was the real significant change.
Well, I thank you for clarifying that, and your humility is always very touching, because I didn't mean to imply that because of you the zoo expanded, just because of you, but you certainly did have a very, from my understanding and speaking to people that I know that work and volunteer there, whether they know it was from you or not, the atmosphere and the feeling of being valued.
Yes.
Is what matters. And that's something that I think anyone and everyone listening to this can take back at whatever point you're a leader, whether you're a leader at work or at home or in an organization or as a parent or even whatever. We can all be leaders. But looking at people as people and valuing them for just who they are, I think is critical. And you talked about, giving value and what you get. Another segue here. That'll shift me back just a little bit to, we've talked off the recording about the go-giver and that whole philosophy of turning our attention from getting to giving is not just profitable, but it's a great way to live. That is true in all aspects. And I think that giving value isn't that hard when it comes to people. Just in the supermarket, if you look at someone and you give a smile, not a big cheesy, like, hey, look at me kind of a smile, which I can do and have, but just an acknowledging look, just a smile. The difference in someone's face when I think to do that is palpable. It's amazing. And so more of that and less of you stay over there, I think is really important. So a couple of final things here. I don't want to keep you too late. I very much appreciate your time. But we've also talked about, and I'm going to tie this back in. It's not truly self-serving, but another one of my guests, episode 20, happens to be my most favorite guest of all time, because not only is she brilliant in business and life, she also happens to be my wife. But you listen to Tara's podcast. And she has listened to one of your talks when she was here in St. Louis before you two knew each other personally. What really impresses me is my wife, born in Zimbabwe, raised in South Africa, living in the Middle East for 25 years, a white woman. And Fred Falker, a Black man born in Indiana, moved to Missouri, and a whole different set of parameters in your lives, and yet you two share so many common traits and beliefs and appreciate so many of the same things, and the concept of giving value and valuing people. And I want to bring that up because I think it's just as clear an example for me of realizing that lines are artificial. and you can be close to someone. Tara mentioned to me, and this is another thing I want to touch on. She said, one of the things that she was really impressed with Fred is how your presence and just your stature, and how you carry yourself and how you communicate and how you're kind of unflappable. And it reminded her of her youth in South Africa of Nelson Mandela, which is, I know you took that as a huge compliment, but it also turns out that you and he share a birthday.
Yes. So on my birthday, I'm celebrating the life of Nelson Mandela. And that's an interesting feeling because you have to feel humbled. I mean, you don't even want to put yourself in that, except that we're born on the same day. So that is absolutely true.
Yeah. Well, I think that's just really a cool thing. And so another thing is, do you, and you know this question's coming because I told you it would, do you ever get angry? Because you never seem upset. You never seem anything but cool, calm, collected, somewhere between Nelson Mandela and like 007, just always in control, and you got it going on.
I think I do get angry. I think the way I think about things, I try very hard to kind of think about the other person, the other human being, and I think I heard your wife say this, and to not take things personally. That anger that I see from others is not usually about me. It is almost always about them. I will tell you that I was or still am a basketball official, and I've been one for almost 50 years. And I have given out very, 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 very few technical fouls. And I would think that I've given out less than 3 or 4 in the last 15 years. So I don't get angry very often. I had the occasion to, and I think I might have mentioned this to you, 4 or 5 years ago, I'm at one of the local high schools, and it's a school that I had worked at a lot, and the game is over and it's getting kind of rough and physical. And I've had a hard time with one of the coaches. He's been screaming at me and my partners the whole game. The game is over. It's crazy stuff is happening, and he's still screaming. And I can just remember walking over to the table, and I think I must have screamed at him, because he and his other coaches looked stunned. The people at the table where we walk and report our fouls, they looked stunned. And one of the guys came in the locker room after the game, and he just looked at me and he said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We have never, ever seen you angry." So yes, I can get angry. And I don't think getting angry is the worst thing in the world. But I think our ability to make amends, our ability to kind of rethink that anger and what it is that we didn't notice, didn't see, appreciate about the other human beings involved in that. And were they also angry? The stories that we tell ourselves, if we can get back to that, we can get to the place where we don't stay angry. Mm-hmm. Getting angry is one thing. Staying angry is where wars come from. Staying angry is where we can't make changes. Staying angry is what allows some of the real terrible things that happen in the world to happen. Staying angry is the problem. Getting angry it's human.
Yeah, and speaking as someone who has had his share of angry moments in my life, I've been told by many that I could certainly improve my equanimity, and I strive to do that. And I think the secret to that is what you just touched on, and probably why you are able to remain calm more often than not. And that is trying to understand the other person and not taking it personally. If I'm driving down the highway and someone cuts in front of me, they're not saying, "Oh, look, there's Bill, I'm going to cut in front of him."
That's right.
Who knows what they have going on?
That's right.
Are they jerks? Yes. Can I get upset when they do that? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Should I let it go? And have I learned to let it go? Yes, absolutely. Just along that line, I had a friend years ago say, I think I'm getting better at this. I only chase people 2 exits past mine now, which I offer up for humor only. Fred, thank you so much for your time. Your intelligence, your wisdom, your kindness, your caring, your perspective are all fabulous. You've delivered great value. I hope everyone listens to this and then listens to it again and then listens to it again. If you want to see Ted talk, if you want to see Fred talking, he has a TEDx talk, which will be in the show notes, but that's titled From Difference to Distance, Rethinking Diversity and Inclusion. It's 19 minutes of magic. I encourage you to look at that. But before we go, the question that everyone on the show has asked, in the context of your life, in the context of your work, in the context of our conversation, what's the point?
Leave the world a better place. Leave the world a better place. Add more than you take away. We talk about carbon neutral. Apply carbon neutral to your life. Are you a net negative, or are you adding something of value? And I think whatever you do in life, if we're adding more than we are taking, then that's the point of life. I think that's what I've always wanted to do. I think that's what I've always attempted to do, to make most things better. I want to help the world itself actually be different. I think I'm on the right path, but I recognize that paradigm shifts take a long time. Mm-hmm. I hope that there are other people who will kind of follow up on some of this thinking and on some of the work that I'm currently involved in.
Well, first of all, I absolutely love the simplicity of your initial response to what's the point, and that's leave the world a better place. That is powerful, and that is doable by all of us. That's right. Not the entire world, but our part of the world. We can all leave a better place. So thank you for that. And I have seen and heard and researched and talked to people enough to know that you are doing exactly that. The impact of your work will be carried on because it's very impactful. So I appreciate you sharing your time and your knowledge and your wisdom, and I wish you the very best of luck. So everyone, look up Fred Falker on TED in the show notes. Listen to what he has to say, learn from him. If you've enjoyed today's episode, let me encourage you to check out some of the other guests we've had. You heard me mention our friend Barry and my wife Tara. There are just so many diverse guests that have been on the show. I'm very blessed in that regard. Check them out because you will definitely learn some things. And thank you for listening today. And again, Fred, thank you so much, not just for your work in general, but for your time today and just for being the human being that you are. Thank you.
Bill, thank you so much, and give your wife my best. Even though I've never officially met her, I feel like I know her now.
Well, we'll definitely get together the next time she's here.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. We can promise you'll gain value in every one. Rating and reviewing makes us more discoverable and helps others find out what's the point. And if you'd like to know more about Bill Ellis or contact him, please visit his website, www.brandingpillars.com. See you next time.